Previous video, I talked about setting up your workspace, and now I've jumped right back into my welcome screen. I just closed out a previous work file that I had open, and I'm right back where I started again. I'm going to go to File, New. I'll click Print, standard 8.5 by 11. You can see my measurements are set up for inches, 8.5 by 11. And there's a simple open file. I want to make sure that once I have my workspace set up, I want to make sure that everything under the hood, the engine of the program, the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that I don't necessarily have to look at, is also working. And that is your preferences. So again, on a Mac, I go to Photoshop Preferences. Some of your machines might say Settings. And you go to the General Settings or Preferences. On a PC, that would be Edit menu. Down near the bottom is Preferences, and you would go to General. The keyboard shortcuts for that is on a Mac, Command key and the letter K. On a PC, that would be Control key and the letter K for preferences, I guess. But K or Command K on a Mac or Control K on a PC will get you into your preferences. Might as well start using keyboard shortcuts because I'm going to be introducing you to a lot of them. So right here in our general preferences, the good thing about Photoshop is you have a lot of controls. The bad thing about Photoshop, you have a lot of controls. So I'm really just going to go over the ones that really will affect you as I teach my classes. Again, these are highly recommended suggestions. They're not absolute requirements, but these settings have always worked for me, so I'm going to pass those on to you. You can customize them how you wish, but this is how I've been teaching for years and years, and it's always worked out great for my students and myself, so I'm going to keep continuing in this tradition. So right here under General Preferences, if you are in Adobe Photoshop, go with the Adobe Color Picker. HUD means Heads Up Display. You want your color picker to be a small hue strip. This is a small hue strip right up here. This is your visible spectrum of colors. These are the range of values from the brightest value of that color to the purest, down to the darkest. But that's a hue strip right there. Image interpolation means interpretation. How is Photoshop going to deal with your images when you resize them, when you rotate them, when you transform them? You have all these different settings, but for the first 25 years, it was always set to bicubic automatic. I would suggest you leave it there. Okay, you might notice these little yellow bars popping up. Those are little helpful hints. I always keep them on just to be safe. You do have the ability to turn them off, I believe, under Tools. Yeah, they're called Rich Tooltips. So if these yellow bars start to disturb you after a while, you can select to don't show Rich Tooltips, but I like them, so I'm going to keep them. So again, back here under General. Anything, and again, this is just my opinion, anything that says auto, I don't trust. I want to make sure I'm doing things. I don't just leave it in the hands. I trust my computer. It's a machine, okay? And if a machine screws up, I'm the one responsible. So I don't trust anything that says auto. Automatically show the home screen. I'm going to totally contradict myself and say auto show the home screen. Okay, that just means when I close out a file, the home screen will come up. I like viewing the home screen on my computer. If you don't like looking at the home screen, don't automatically show it. But I do. That's my one case where I'll start off saying, don't trust auto, but then use auto. Kind of funny. Use legacy. New document interface. Legacy means older versions. And I don't want to go back in time. I want to teach you with the most current. So I'm not going to use legacy new document interfaces. I'm going to leave that off. I'm going to use new document interfaces that are the current standard. Skip transforming when placing. I'll leave that off. Use legacy free transform. Again, this is using transformations the old-fashioned way. For years and years, when you wanted to transform something proportionally, you had to hold your shift key. Then, all of a sudden, Adobe said, hey, all that stuff we've been teaching you for 20 years, forget it. You don't have to hold the shift key. And that really messed people up. So if they wanted to still use the shift key, they could do that. They could use the legacy free transform. I'm not going to go back in time. Okay? Turn that off. I'm going to go with the way Photoshop works today. On the right, beep when done is a throwback to old computers. When you would, 20 years ago, when you would apply a filter, you would see a progress bar slowly moving. It was like watching a timer count down on your microwave oven. The computers were so slow. You really don't need that anymore. Exporting the clipboard. Export means send it out. Clipboard is your storage space. That allows you to copy something here in Photoshop and maybe paste it over into Illustrator, things like that. So I leave that turned on. Resize image during placement. I keep that turned on. You are going to resize or copy images from a lower resolution to a higher resolution, etc. Downloading images from the internet, from Google, and then adding them to your high resolution files. You want those images to resize accordingly. Smart objects are advanced layer features. I will get to that much later. I would recommend you keep that off if you are brand new to Photoshop, which in my classes, most people are. And I'm going to be totally honest, I don't know what preset syncing is. I think that's a brand new feature. I'm not familiar with it. And again, for the last 25 years, I've been working in Photoshop, never had this anyway, so I'm going to skip over it for right now. I'm human. Okay, when you are done with each category, you can click Next. The only thing I would change on the interface is keep it dark. 25 years ago, Photoshop was really bright, and that just burned out your eyeballs. Okay, over the years, it's gotten a little darker and a little darker, or if this still kind of messes with your eyes, you could go really dark. But I tend to go with this one, which is, again, the default. You could see right here, we've got a dark workspace around our file, but sometimes you might have a dark background on a photo. And they say they're trying to indicate, Photoshop is saying it's trying to indicate the edge with a drop shadow. Okay, what I would highly recommend, it's not required, but I highly recommend you set your borders to a standard line, a simple deviation defining the edge of your file. I put everything on lines. It just makes things more clear on your screen. And that's it. Okay. All these other features are all defaults. I don't even bother to look at them. They're going to work just fine how we're doing here. I'm going to click Next. These are all default settings on your workspace preferences. So I don't like my panels to automatically turn on and off. Okay. Auto collapse. Don't collapse my panels. I'll collapse them when I want them to be off the screen. Don't let Photoshop automatically do that stuff for you. Automatically show hidden panels. Why would it show them if they're hidden? That doesn't make sense to me, so I'll turn that off. It's auto. I don't like it. I'll click Next. And again, tooltips. These are these little tooltips that pop up. Okay. If you like them, great. If you don't like them, you can turn those off. That's fine. Enabling gestures is more for iPads and things like that. Use Shift key for tool switch. There are multiple tools here in Photoshop. So let me show you that. I'm going to click OK for a second. I'm going to press and hold on this first one up here on the upper right of my toolbox, and you'll notice the rectangle marquee is designated by hitting the letter M, but the elliptical marquee is also designated by hitting the letter M. Well, how is Photoshop going to know if I want the rectangle or the ellipse if they both are designated by hitting the letter M? Okay, so that's Shift key. So if I hit M, there's my rectangle, Shift and the letter M, and now I go to the elliptical marquee. So that's how you switch between tools. Some of these, like your photo retouching tools, you have 6 of them, and they're all designated with the letter J. Okay, so again, you would hit Shift and J. Now I'm on the remove tool, Shift and J. Now I'm on the healing brush, Shift and J. Now I'm on the patch tool, Shift and J. Now I'm on the content aware move tool. There we go. Shift and J. Now I'm on the red eye tool, Shift and J, and I go back to the spot healing brush. Okay, that's what the Shift key for tool switches means. So again, you can go right back to Photoshop and preferences or settings on a Mac. If you're on a PC, it would be Edit and down here to Preferences, or just hit Command K on a Mac or Control K on a PC, and we come right back up to the tools. Okay, that's what Shift key for tool switch means. Over scroll, I've never used it, so I'll just leave it on. Flick panning is great. It allows you to zoom in and kind of flick your screen, much like flipping an image on the screen on your cell phone. You flick images as they fly across your screen. Double-clicking your layer mask icon launches the Select and Mask workspace. Leave that on. We're going to be dealing with a lot of masking and layer masking later, so it's a good feature to have. You're not going to use it right away, but it's a good feature to leave it on. Round brush hardness is based on HUD, heads up display vertical movement. I'm going to be showing you how to adjust your brushes and brush sizes very soon. You absolutely want to keep that on. Arrow keys will rotate your brush tips. Kind of fun to play with later on, so I'll leave that on. Anything that says snap is going to treat things almost like magnets. So if I try to move something close to the edge and it snaps, it's going to go right on the edge, even though I didn't want it to go right on the edge. So snap, I don't trust. I turn that off. What they, excuse me, what Adobe added is this feature where they took away the reference point when transforming objects. Highly do not recommend that. I highly recommend you show your reference point when you are transforming objects. Spring-loaded tool shortcuts, I'll show you that in a minute. Zoom with the scroll wheel if you have that on your mouse. I leave that up to you. I don't use it. I don't recommend it. But again, it's a recommendation. I do recommend animated zoom. That definitely helps. I do not recommend zoom resizes the whole window of Photoshop because things are going to be flashing all over your screen. So you probably want to leave that off. Zoom the click point to the center. Highly recommend. That means if you have a group of friends and you zoom in on your 5th friend on the right, they're going to fly right off the edge of your screen. But if you zoom on them, it'll bring them back to the center of your screen. So I highly recommend that. Let's see what spring-loaded tool shortcuts mean. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to come over to my brush. If I press and hold, I got a few of them. I'll just go to the normal brush tool. And I'm going to create a brand new layer. Okay, I've got my layers panel ready. Right down here is this little plus. I have a new layer to paint on. Right here is my brush tip, which you can barely see. So right up here when I click, I've got a size. We'll just drag that over a little bit more and a little bit more. About 130. I click right out here, click, and that big window disappears. So now, here's what a spring-loaded brush does. If I click and drag, and I keep my mouse held down, I hit the letter E. And now when I let go, I should be able to erase. But it doesn't work. Okay? So I don't like the idea of spring-loaded brush tips. Half the time they work, half the time they don't. So again, B for brush, press and hold, E, but I'm not getting that. Okay? I prefer to paint and then let go. Hit E, and I can erase. B for brush, paint, E for erase, and erase. It's that simple. I don't trust those spring-loaded things. They just mess with me. It's too many advanced features, and heck, I couldn't even get it to work here. Okay, so I don't recommend that. It's just more advanced working methods, and I'm not ready for those yet. So I'm going to go back, Command K for preferences, go back to my tools, and turn off spring-loaded tool shortcuts. Okay? They're a headache. You try them out later, use them if you want, but I don't recommend them. I mean, heck, you can see right there, I'm human. I couldn't even get it to work right. So turn it off. I'm going to click next. Under the history, there is nothing to change here. These are all just default settings. I don't even look at them. Okay? Photoshop works fine as it is. I'm going to click next. Under file saving, image previews, always save an image preview. File extensions, always use lowercase file extensions. Default file location, I always recommend you save to your computer. Just to be safe, you keep control of the situation. Everything else is default. I'm not going to mess with it. When you click next, exporting your files as PNG files is great because it preserves transparency. Nothing else I need to click on here. When I click next, under performance, that's the amount of memory dedicated to run Photoshop. If you're working, let's say, on a laptop and it starts slowing down, you have a history state. The default is 50. Okay, you're asking people, or you're asking Photoshop to remember 50 things that people have done on the file. Okay, I don't want to have to remember 50 things I've done, or I don't want Photoshop to remember 50 things I've done. The more it has to remember, slower your computer is going to go. The more RAM it's going to take. So if you eventually see your Photoshop slowing down, you might want to lower this to maybe 20 and then restart Photoshop, and that can definitely help. But for the most part, I leave my preferences, performance, leave it alone. Click next. Image processing, there's nothing to change here. These are all default settings. Scratch disks is where Photoshop gets the memory from to actually run the program. It's running right off my hard drive or your hard drive, so leave the scratch disks alone. Under painting cursors, most tools, brushes, photo retouching tools, things like that, they're going to work with cursors. You do not want a standard cursor. So that means if I clicked on my paintbrush and I go to use the paintbrush, I'm going to see a tiny little brush icon. The problem is that brush could represent 20 pixels or that brush could represent 1,000 pixels. You don't know the size, so I don't recommend that. It's very deceptive. Under precise, that's even worse. You get a little crosshair, and that crosshair can get lost on your screen amongst a bunch of details in a photograph, so I don't recommend precise. All I have ever worked with is normal brush tips. That's going to show you the core amount of detail or painting or photo retouching you're going to be doing. Okay, I don't recommend a full-size brush tip because that's going to show you the very outer edge of the overspray. So it looks like you're using a large brush, but you're really just working in the core of the center of that brush. So I don't recommend a full-size brush tip. Everything beyond that is just advanced features you don't need. Show the crosshair in the brush tip. Why? You already have the brush tip itself. Show only the crosshair while you're painting. That's just going to get really repetitive because it's going to keep turning on and off. And there is a feature called brush leash. I don't recommend that. It just shows a light magenta bar following the path that you're painting anyway. I really have not found that useful in any way whatsoever. So I just keep it turned off. If you want to experiment, have at it. Have a great time. In my class, it's not necessary. I would recommend going no further down than your normal brush tip. I've worked with that for the last 25 years. It's been great. It's always worked for me, so I'm always going to recommend it to everybody else. I recommend what has worked. Okay, on the right, you have other cursor. So while you're painting with your brush, you can hold your Option key on a Mac or your Alt key on a PC, and it's a keyboard toggle for your eyedropper tool. You'll either get the standard eyedropper or the precise cursor, which again gives you a pinpoint like a target, which I don't recommend. I usually keep that on standard. We will be working with brush tips in chapter 2. And you can see how big your brush is going to be. It'll show up in red as a preview. So you keep that on red. When you click next under transparency, Photoshop indicates empty spaces with a grid because you can paint a layer with white paint, like painting a wall or painting white paint on a sheet of glass. Okay, so you don't want white to represent nothing. You want a grid to represent transparency. The default is a medium colored or medium sized light colored grid. You don't want large squares because that can get a bit intrusive in some of the details in your photo. I would recommend a medium light colored grid. Okay, when you are working digitally, looking at your screen, you're going to be looking at colors that are brighter than what you can get on a printer. You know, monitors will display almost neon vibrancy colors. You don't have neon inks in your printer. So there is a warning called the gamut warning. It's a visual test. I'll show you that later. But you can do the visual test, and any colors that turn up as gray represent colors that are too bright for your printer, because I hear that a lot. When students turn in work, I say, how do you like your printed output? And they say, the colors look bad. I say, yeah, because you're going from digital color, bright, to inks on paper. And those can dull your color. So there are some gamut warnings that I'll show you. Under next, what I recommend for your rulers is always measure things as inches. Type is always measured as points. These are default settings from the column size. These are default settings for your print resolution. This is the default setting for PostScript files and fonts. Anything you do for print should be 300 pixels per inch. Anything you do for screen, like websites and stuff like that, is lower resolution because monitors display details in lower resolution. Printing requires higher details, so higher resolution. Under next, when you get to your canvas guides, I would recommend red. Any bright color like green or cyan is going to be hard to see on the screen. Okay, so I typically go with red guides. Artboard guides, I don't really use those, so I'll just keep them on the light blue. If you need to measure things in a grid, you have the ability to create a colored grid. I'm not going to do any of those colors. It's like putting graph paper right on top of your scan if you wanted. Slices is for websites, which we're not going to be doing. Paths is drawing tracings around objects. We will get to those in chapter 10. You can change the color of your tracing based on the color of what you're tracing in the photo, which is kind of nice. And honestly, I don't use control colors. I don't even know what they are. I'll be honest. So just leave it on default. Never affected me anyway. Okay, when I click next under plugins, very, very important. You have a button right up here, show all filter gallery groups and names. You want to make sure that is turned on. If this is turned off, you're only going to get half of your filters to work with. It's going to limit your choices. So keep that button turned on. Okay, everything else is default. I don't need to activate anything else here right now. When I click next and I go to type, these are all my default settings. I don't need to mess with any of those. I'll leave it be. Everything else after type, we're not going to be using. We're not going to be doing 3D art. We're not going to be using a touch bar. I don't even know what that is. Might as well leave it on. It doesn't affect us anyway. Under technology previews, these are default settings, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. I'm not going to mess with those. And under productivity improvement, if you'd like to participate in future beta testing and things like that, sure, you can try to participate if you want to. Just read the information here, but I'm not going to do that for now. I'm going to click next. That'll take me right back to the beginning, and I know I'm done, so I will click OK. Okay, if I don't need this extra layer, I can click once right there to activate it, click on the trash, and it'll say, are you sure you want to delete that? Yes. All typical standard files start with a background layer. And now that I have set up your workspace, and I have shown you your preferences, it's time to get working in Photoshop. So I'll see you in the next chapter, and we'll talk about brush tips and layers. Thanks for hanging in there. I know this was a long video, but got to go through the basics to get to the fun stuff. So thanks for sticking with me.